Hi, my name's Phil. I like to talk about politics. In this video, I'd like to discuss the document produced by the British government at last, which sets out their aims for a free trade deal with the United States and whether or not it's going to represent a good deal for the people of Britain. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news in politics, then please subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon. So, a very quick recap of events on the road to a possible US trade deal so far. So, a year ago, just over a year ago now, the United States published their proposals. It included measures that would have meant the lowering of British standards, being forced to buy American goods even when there were cheaper alternatives elsewhere. There were a number of other worrying aspects as well. And we also know that British ministers and officials were meeting in secret with their counterparts in the United States last year to discuss the details of the deal. A leaked record of these meetings made it clear that the UK understands that we will not get a US trade deal if we get a deal with the EU. It's one or the other. And, the documents also made it clear that we were choosing the US deal over the EU deal. Then the US, at least publicly, told us to piss off and said that they were going to be starting trade talks with the EU and they weren't interested in trade talks with us, whether that was down to Boris Johnson's Huawei decision or whatever. We didn't really know. But a court case earlier this year did force government lawyers to admit that the UK was in secret trade talks with at least one unnamed country, which remains unnamed. We don't know who it is, or indeed if there's more than one. Now, it's not impossible, I speculated at the time, that it could be with the United States, that they are publicly shunning us, but in private holding these meetings so that there isn't the public scrutiny, because the deal does not represent a good deal for Britain. And, you would expect that from the US side of things, sure enough, but then you would expect the British side to be wanting to push for things that will be good for us. That way you end up with a compromise at the end of it with a deal that is good for both sides. Not as good for either side as they might have liked, but good for both sides. An improvement, shall we say. But given that we believe that Boris Johnson isn't interested in a deal that's good for the UK, but just one that furthers his ideals of deregulating the country, in other words, good for him and good for his mates, then that would explain why they're holding them in secret, because they don't want to answer any awkward questions. So, in reading the document, finally published, I wanted to see if there's any clues that they will be essentially going along with what the US wants, but trying to sell it to the British public as if it's good for us. I didn't have to go very far, actually. The introductory page described the United States as a high-wage economy with high standards. Now, as to the high wage, yeah, fair enough. You can certainly argue that it is one of the highest wage countries, and the larger ones certainly, definitely higher wages on average than in the UK. Although I would always argue, because they don't have a lot of public services, the actual costs are much higher in America as well for healthcare, social care, things like that, and even education. Which means that, your effective wage is not necessarily as high as it actually is. But it is you can call it a high wage economy, absolutely. High standards, though. Standards. The entire point of the US proposals, when you read them, and I'll put a link to that in the description below as well if you haven't read it already, was to lower standards in the UK in order to be able to import the produce that they're not currently allowed to. The produce that they are currently allowed to export to the UK is, of course, fine. And we'd still be able to carry on with that. That's not what they're interested in. From our point of view, we're interested in just reducing tariffs. The US is not. The US isn't bothered about that. The US is interested in being able to sell things to us that it currently cannot. That means lowering standards. So by definition, describing the US as having high standards would seem to me to be trying to start the argument that, their standards are actually really high. Yeah, I know we're changing our standards and it looks like they're going down, but actually they're just really aligning with the US, which is really high standards, of course. A repeated theme in the document as well is that the deal will mean higher wages for UK workers and lower prices. Isn't that fantastic? Wouldn't we all like that? However, it has already been shown that even a good free trade deal, in other words, just a trade deal that means just removing tariffs, wouldn't actually have that much impact on cost of goods. We already trade with them on very low average tariffs, and I covered that in a video last week. The document also describes the US as Britain's largest bilateral trading partner. Now, this is playing on words, I'm sure, but a worrying sign for me as well. The EU, as partners go, the EU is much, much bigger than the United States. Now, I know what they're trying to do here, hide it in the line with the bilateral thing. You know, as members of the EU was not a bilateral trading partner. We had a full comprehensive agreement with the EU. Bilateral means when you don't have particularly with trade, when we're talking about trade, it means you don't have a fully comprehensive trade deal, but you have a series of what are called bilateral agreements. Lots of little agreements on various different things. All very messy. Much better to have a full comprehensive agreement. Now, demonstrably, the EU is a much larger trading partner. They'll be trying to say, but it's not a bilateral trading partner because we have a full comprehensive deal with them. But we don't. We did do as a member. We're not members anymore. We don't. So, again, now that we're no longer members, as we don't have a comprehensive deal agreed, and it doesn't look like there's any prospect of getting that, it is a bilateral trading partner. So describing it as not as large as the US, what they're trying to do is emphasise to the British public, I think, with this line, that the US is our most important trading partner. And of course, so that when criticisms come in about it, they've got to say, yeah, I know, but we've got to compromise because they are our most important trading partner. We have to prioritise a trade deal with them, of course. But no. There are also things in the document that sound like they have Britain's interests at heart. You know, it's not a sham all the way through, but they do ring a little bit hollow. So give you a little example. It talks about an agreement that takes into account British agriculture. So in the agreement, we have to be sensitive to the needs of British agriculture, not run roughshod over it. Now, naturally, a completely free trade deal with the US, along the lines proposed by them last year, would completely kill off British agriculture because we certainly wouldn't be selling very much to the United States, and no deal with the EU knackers sales throughout Europe as well. And then we also have to remember that very recently the British government asked its advisors to comment on the consequences of British farming collapsing. They would say, how serious is it? The response came back, which is what was leaked, not that serious, yeah, you can get away with it. So given that we already have evidence that the British government seem willing to let agriculture fail in this country, there is no reason to believe that this stated desire to protect British agriculture, or indeed any of our industries, is genuinely meant. Now, some aspects of the document could indeed be considered areas for negotiation, such as copyright laws. But these are essentially asking the United States to adopt laws that would suit us and not them. Now, the situation is that the UK is desperate for this trade deal. Actually, when I say that, I mean the UK government. The UK itself desperately wants nothing to do with this trade deal, but those who represent us are desperate for it. And the US is the single most powerful country in the world. The idea that we will get them to adopt laws that doesn't favour them is frankly laughable. So I would ignore all of those things. Sure, negotiate them, but the US is basically going to say no. There is a commitment to not compromise on food standards, but it also says we'll be changing them. So like I said before, what I would read into that is, we're absolutely going to maintain food standards. And then when they change them, it says, but it's equivalent. We're just changing them to align with the United States. But it's actually the same thing. We're not actually lowering them. We're just changing them. I think that's what will come out of that. It's, again, just to try and allay people's fears. And it's not like when we change them, it's going to be increasing standards. If the intention was to increase our standards, we'd have signed the legally binding commitment to do so, as Theresa May was prepared to do. And although the document did say that we'll maintain food and environmental standards, again, I don't believe that, but it says that they will, it was less unequivocal about workers' rights. Did not make the same commitment there. Probably because it's harder to diminish these without people noticing. Like if food standards go down, a lot of people won't notice. If environmental standards go down, people won't notice. If workers' rights go down, people will notice because they're workers and they'll notice their own rights have been diminished. The document simply states that workers' rights will be high. Now, doesn't define where the bar is. How do you define what is high? Given that in the UK we have amongst the lowest worker rights in the developed world, and we could argue it would be the lowest if it weren't for the United States, I would suggest that refusing to promise to keep them at least as high as they are now is telling. Finally, there was a section at the back, quite a large section, which it made the document look much bigger than it really is in detail, which was supposedly public responses to surveys about various priorities, asking the British public, what are your priorities for the US trade deal? It noted, amongst other things, that people wanted the deal to be secondary to international laws in areas such as human rights. Now, given that the government are saying that they intend to pull us out of international human rights laws, they have said that in the last week, particularly the European Convention of Human Rights, which, by the way, has nothing to do with the EU. The EU adopt it as well, but it's not an EU convention. Does make me wonder if this is all a bit of a smokescreen. Basically, you've got a large section at the back of this document that details all the things that the British public, or at least in this sample, are telling the government that they want to see in this deal. And people might read it and go, oh, they've published it as well, so they intend to honour this. Doesn't say that. What I would look at here, I mean, this is a government that lies anyway, so even unequivocal statements I would be sceptical about. However, if it says something, if there's an implication in there, ignore it completely. Only focus on what is promised, not what is implied. And that means you've got to look at it with a very critical eye. But anyway, those are my initial thoughts on having read it a few times. Let me know yours in the comments below if you want to read it. Of course, I will put a description and the link below. If you found the video interesting, please click the like button. And if you'd like to support the channel further, then please also click the Patreon link for details. And until next time, I'll see you later.